People keep telling me they're planning to buy a house in 2026 because they're convinced prices will finally come down. And every time I hear that, I'm reminded of how dangerous it is when the calendar becomes your financial advisor. I've lived through more market cycles than most people have seen presidents. And one lesson repeats itself every decade. The moment people expect the market to correct for their convenience is the moment they're walking straight into a trap. I saw it in the 1970s when young couples stretched themselves to buy homes because someone convinced them the next year would bring a miracle. I saw it again in the late 1980s when speculation pushed families so deep into mortgage commitments that they spent the next decade digging themselves out. And I watched it happen spectacularly in 2007 when people said, well, real estate can't go down everywhere at once, only to discover that confidence doesn't protect you from mathematics. What worries me about 2026 isn't the housing market itself. Markets always move. It's the belief that timing alone will save people. When buyers wait for a round number year to make a life-changing decision, they aren't thinking about affordability, debt ratios, or long-term value. They're thinking about hope. And hope, while emotionally comforting, has destroyed more household wealth than any economic downturn you can name. If 2026 brings what I think it might, higher carrying costs, squeezed credit, and a record number of people entering the market simply because they think they're supposed to, then many buyers will find themselves owning a house they can't comfortably afford, purchased in a year they assumed would be safe simply because it followed 2025. Houses don't care about your schedule. Markets don't reward impatience. And the most expensive mistake you can make is believing the market will cooperate with your plans. When people ask me why I'm so cautious about 2026, I tell them to look not at prices but at behavior. Because behavior always reveals the real danger long before the numbers do. Right now, at the end of 2025, I'm seeing the same pattern I've seen before every major housing mistake in my lifetime. Too many buyers anchoring their decisions to headlines instead of fundamentals. Too many families convinced that patience has an expiration date. Too many investors assuming that a cooling market guarantees a bargain. But bargains aren't created by the calendar. They're created when fear outweighs optimism, when sellers feel pressure, and when financing becomes restrictive enough to force discipline back into the system. That's not what I'm seeing yet. What I see are people tired of waiting and ready to jump simply because they believe 2026 will finally reward them for their frustration. That's the mindset that leads to overpaying. Because once someone is emotionally committed to buying, they interpret every minor dip as a signal and every flat month as proof that the crash is right around the corner. I've watched people lose more money from impatience than from bad markets. Because impatience convinces them that any price is acceptable as long as the purchase happens before it's too late. And when you combine impatience with rising long-term costs, insurance, taxes, maintenance, and the very real possibility of tighter lending, you create a scenario where buyers think they're being strategic, when in reality they're stepping toward a financial weight they'll be carrying for decades. When a market enters a period of uncertainty, people start believing that any movement in their favor is a sign of stability, when in reality it's often nothing more than noise caused by short-term sentiment. I've watched buyers in multiple decades misread slowing sales as an opportunity, not realizing that slowing sales can just as easily signal weakening affordability, tightening credit, or buyers simply stepping back because the cost of ownership has quietly climbed higher than the headlines suggest. A home is not just the purchase price, it's the insurance that rises every year, the property taxes that adjust upward long after the excitement wears off, the repairs that don't care whether you got a deal, and the interest you pay over decades, not months. In 2026, many people will look only at the sticker price and assume a few percentage points off the peak means safety. But real safety doesn't come from a discount, it comes from margin, from cash reserves, from buying below your means instead of stretching because you think the window is closing. I've seen people buy houses that technically fit the budget, only to learn that fitting the budget on paper is very different from living with the monthly reality. What concerns me is that too many families are preparing for 2026 as if it's the year the market will finally reward them for waiting, instead of preparing for the possibility that it may be a year that demands even more discipline, patience, and selectivity. Markets don't hand out trophies for endurance. They punish anyone who confuses the passage of time with improved conditions. I've built my entire career on the idea that you should only act when the price and the circumstances favor you, not when your emotions tell you the moment feels right. And if there is one mistake I've seen repeated more than any other in housing, it's the belief that the market owes you a fair entry point. It doesn't. You have to wait for one, and waiting often lasts longer than people want it to. People often underestimate how slowly fundamentals adjust after a period of overheated demand. And that's why 2026 worries me more than any single number or forecast. By the time the average buyer feels safe, the smart money has already moved. The disciplined buyers have already stepped aside. And the people entering the market are the ones driven not by opportunity but by fatigue. Fatigue is one of the most expensive emotions in finance. It makes buyers say things like, "I'm tired of renting," or "I just want stability," and while those feelings are understandable, they have nothing to do with value. A home should be bought when the long-term financial picture supports it, not when your patience runs out. I've seen individuals spend the next 20 years paying for a decision they made in a moment of emotional exhaustion, and the saddest part is that they didn't make a bad choice, they made a rushed one. In 2026, when interest rates may still be elevated, when credit standards could tighten, and when many sellers will refuse too lower prices because they anchored their expectations to the highs of the early decade, buyers will think they're negotiating when in reality they're just accepting the least bad option. That's not investing, that's surrender. I learned early in my life that you should never enter a deal from a position of surrender because the terms will always reflect your weakness, not the value of the asset. And when you combine surrender with leverage, which is what a mortgage fundamentally is, you turn a single emotional decision into a multi-decade obligation. If people truly understood how much of their future freedom they trade away when they stretch for a house at the wrong time, they would be far more patient. A home can give you comfort, but debt can take that comfort away faster than any price. Drop ever could. What most people fail to appreciate is that the housing market doesn't need to crash to become dangerous, it just needs to stagnate while costs continue rising underneath the surface, quietly tightening the vice on anyone who bought without enough margin. I've lived long enough to see that flat markets can be more punishing than falling ones, because falling markets at least force people to confront reality, while flat markets let them drift deeper into financial discomfort without realizing what's happening. In 2026, a lot of buyers expecting some dramatic correction may instead face something far trickier: prices that stop rising but refuse to fall, combined with insurance premiums climbing year after year, local governments adjusting property taxes upward to cover deficits, and maintenance costs escalating as aging infrastructure across many cities demands more frequent and expensive repairs. You don't see those numbers in the headlines, you feel them in your bank account. And that's precisely why timing a home purchase based on a big drop is one of the riskiest plans someone can make. If the drop never comes, buyers end up paying peak expenses at non-peak prices, which is the worst combination. I've watched countless investors wipe out their margins not because they overpaid on day one, but because they underestimated the cumulative impact of carrying costs over 10, 20, 30 years. A mortgage is just one part of the burden, the smallest part for some families, yet people obsess over interest rates while ignoring the slow, predictable creep of everything else. That's why I always look at total risk, not just purchase price. In 2026, the real risk may not be that homes become unaffordable overnight, but that people by assuming stability in a system that is anything but stable. When the economic winds shift, and they always do, the people who stretched themselves thin because they believed the year on the calendar guaranteed safety will discover that the market doesn't reward optimism. It rewards preparation. You don't need a crash to be hurt. All you need is a long period in which your costs rise faster than your income, and housing has a remarkable ability to create exactly that scenario when buyers step in without enough margin, patience, or skepticism. People talk about home ownership as if it guarantees wealth, but guarantees don't exist in markets, only probabilities and responsibilities. I've seen periods where owning a home was one of the best financial decisions a person could make, and I've seen periods where it became a long, quiet drain on every part of their budget. The difference wasn't the house, it was the timing, the debt load, and the expectations people attached to the purchase. When mindset drifts from "I'm buying something I can comfortably afford" to "I'm buying because everyone else is doing it," trouble always follows. And in 2026, I expect a wave of buyers acting not from rational evaluation but from social exhaustion. They spent the last several years hearing that renting is throwing money away, that real estate is the only path to stability, that waiting will make them fall behind. After enough repetition, those ideas start to feel like truths, even though they're nothing more than emotionally charged slogans. What I've learned is that the biggest danger isn't overpaying, it's overcommitting. When people commit to a mortgage that consumes too much of their income, they limit every future decision they can make. They save less, they invest less, they take fewer career risks. They avoid necessary repairs because they're cash strained, and before long, their home, the thing they bought for freedom, becomes the anchor that keeps them from moving anywhere at all. I've watched that pattern unfold again and again, often during periods when people convinced themselves the worst was behind them. And the irony is that housing feels safest right before it becomes restrictive. Markets create comfort just long enough for people to make mistakes. By the time the constraints show up, higher taxes, insurance shocks, unexpected maintenance, or loss of income, the commitments are already locked in and there's no easy exit. That's why I warn people, don't just ask whether you can buy a home in 2026. Ask whether you can afford every part of the life that comes with it. Too many people focus on the keys, not the consequences. A critical mistake people make is assuming that the hardest part of buying a home is the purchase itself, when in reality the hardest part is sustaining the home through every economic season that follows. Anyone can buy when conditions feel calm. The test comes when the unexpected arrives, and it always arrives. A job change, a medical issue, a sudden jump in insurance, a roof that fails 5 years earlier than expected, a property tax reassessment because the county needs revenue. These aren't rare events, they're predictable ones. Yet most families enter the market with budgets built for ideal circumstances, not real ones. In 2026, this gap between expectation and reality will matter more than people realize. Many buyers will assume that stable prices equal safety, but stability can be deceptive. It can lull people into a sense of confidence just long enough for them to take on a commitment they're not equipped to handle if the winds shift. I've always believed in planning for a world that is slightly worse than you expect, because if you're wrong, you simply end up with more cushion. But if you plan for perfect conditions and they don't arrive, the consequences compound quickly. A home purchased at the edge of your financial comfort becomes a source of stress instead of security. I've known families who spent years feeling trapped by a mortgage they once celebrated, Families who couldn't move for better opportunities because selling would leave them with nothing after fees. Families who watched all their available cash disappear into repairs they hadn't budgeted for. And these weren't irresponsible people, they were simply optimistic at the wrong time. Housing magnifies every error because the scale is so large and the leverage so unforgiving. That's why I tell people to be wary of any year that develops a reputation for being the year to buy. When too many people believe the same thing, the crowd becomes the risk. Markets don't reward consensus, they punish it. What matters isn't whether 2026 feels like a fresh start. What matters is whether buyers enter it with discipline, flexibility, and enough margin to absorb the surprises they can't yet see. What people overlook most is how leverage magnifies the consequences of even small miscalculations. And housing is the single largest source of leverage most families will ever take on. A mistake with a car, a vacation, or even a bad investment can be corrected. A mistake with a mortgage can follow you for decades. I've watched buyers convince themselves that a slightly higher payment is manageable because things will improve later, not realizing that optimism is not a financial plan. What concerns me about 2026 is that too many people are relying on hope disguised as strategy. They expect lower rates, easier credit, softer prices, yet none of these outcomes are guaranteed, and even if they occur, they may not occur in the way or the sequence buyers expect. Markets move in their own rhythm, not yours. I've seen entire generations learn this the hard way. The people who rushed into homes in the early 80s thinking rates could only fall. The buyers in the mid-2000s who believed prices could only rise. The families in the late 2010s who overleveraged because they assumed wage growth would continue forever. In every case, the error wasn't in wanting a home, it was in acting as though the market would cooperate simply because they were ready. A home must be purchased from a position of strength, not desire. If your down payment is thin, your emergency savings are minimal, and your income relies on perfect consistency, then any disruption, even a modest one, can turn a proud moment into a long-term strain. Too many people think of home ownership as a milestone instead of a responsibility, and that mindset blinds them to the risks that don't reveal themselves until years later. Decisions made in 2026 won't just affect next year, they'll affect every year that follows. And the people who take on commitments too large, too soon, or under the illusion that timing alone will protect them will discover that the market has a way of humbling even the most confident buyers. That's why patience is an asset, not a delay. A strong financial foundation doesn't slow you down, it keeps you free. People often assume that the danger lies in buying at the top. But the real danger lies in buying without room to maneuver. Because life rarely unfolds exactly as projected on a spreadsheet. I've seen families buy a home thinking they'll grow into the payments, only to find that the world around them became more expensive faster than they became more prosperous. Inflation doesn't announce itself politely. It creeps into every corner of household budgeting, groceries, utilities, childcare, healthcare, turning what once felt manageable into something that requires constant trade-offs. In 2026, this creeping pressure will matter more than most people expect. Because when the general cost of living rises even modestly, the fixed weight of a mortgage becomes heavier relative to everything else. A house doesn't adjust itself to your circumstances. It demands the same payments whether you're thriving or struggling. I've always said that a safe purchase is one where losing your job for a few months wouldn't jeopardize your home, yet very few buyers use that test today. They assume stability in a world that has shown time and again that stability is temporary. When people buy at the edge of their comfort, they lose the flexibility to respond to opportunity, and opportunity is what builds wealth far more reliably than home ownership alone. I've known talented individuals who couldn't take a better job in a different city because selling their house would leave them underwater after fees. I've known entrepreneurs who wanted to start a business but couldn't risk the dip in income. I've known hardworking families who stayed in unhappy jobs because the mortgage left them no breathing room. These consequences don't show up in housing statistics, but they shape lives profoundly. A home should support your future, not restrict it. Yet every housing cycle produces a wave of buyers who only calculate the purchase, not the life that follows. In 2026, sentiment will tempt people to think they've waited long enough and that the market owes them a fair entry. But markets don't owe anything, they simply present opportunities to those who are prepared and obstacles to those who are not. The people who thrive aren't the ones who rush. They're the ones who preserve optionality, protect their downside, and refuse to let impatience dictate a multi-decade commitment. What I want people to understand most is that housing decisions made during transitional periods tend to define not just finances but entire chapters of life, because they lock in a set of constraints that continue shaping your options long after the excitement of the purchase fades. In every cycle I've lived through, I've seen the same pattern repeat. Buyers underestimate how long a market can remain uncertain, how persistently costs can rise even when prices don't, and how quickly a feeling of optimism can turn into a feeling of being trapped. The difference between the people who thrive and the people who struggle is rarely intelligence, it's margin. Margin in savings, margin in income, margin in expectations. When you have margin, life's surprises become inconveniences. When you don't, they become crises. And housing has a way of exposing whether you have margin or not because it leaves no room to hide. A home demands money every month whether the world is kind or harsh. In 2026, a lot of buyers will be walking into commitments built on assumptions that may not hold, that rates will ease, that wages will climb, that stability will return quickly, that governments will keep taxes steady, that maintenance will behave itself, that insurance companies won't continue retreating from riskier regions and pushing premiums sharply higher. But if there's one truth I've learned over 8 decades of watching markets, it's that people consistently underestimate the compounding effect of rising fixed costs. These aren't dramatic headline events, they're slow drips that accumulate into real pressure. A leaking roof doesn't care whether you bought at a discount. A furnace doesn't care that you stretched because you believed 2026 was your year. A tax hike doesn't care about your patience. Yet these are the factors that separate people who enjoy their homes from those who feel chained to them. I've seen people with good intentions and solid discipline spend the better part of their lives recovering from a single overconfident purchase. That's why the timing of 2026 bothers me, not because the year is cursed, but because the psychology entering it is fragile. People are tired. They want certainty. They want the market to finally give them permission. But markets don't grant permission, they reveal whether you were prepared or not. When too many buyers enter with the same expectations, the environment becomes crowded with optimism, and optimism is a poor foundation for a leveraged decision. A home bought at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons, with too little margin, can quietly reshape your entire financial trajectory, closing doors you didn't even realize you'd want open someday. The reward for patience is optionality. The penalty for impatience is obligation. And obligation, once assumed, doesn't loosen its grip easily. In the end, the decision to buy a home should never be driven by impatience, exhaustion, or the belief that a particular year carries some kind of built-in advantage, because none of those factors have ever protected anyone from the realities of long-term debt. What protects you is discipline. What protects you is the ability to walk away when the numbers don't justify the commitment. What protects you is understanding that your financial freedom is more valuable than any set of house keys. I've learned that markets reward people who wait for conditions that clearly favor them, not conditions they hoped would favor them. not conditions they felt they deserved after years of waiting, but conditions grounded in undeniable value and genuine safety margins. If 2026 turns out to be a dangerous year for buyers, it won't be because the housing market suddenly collapses. It will be because people entered it with unrealistic expectations, thin buffers, and the mistaken belief that timing alone could compensate for a lack of preparation. A home purchased wisely can uplift your entire future, but a home purchased prematurely can quietly dictate your financial limits for decades. The regret doesn't appear on day one, it appears slowly in the opportunities you can't take, the savings you can't build, the risks you can't afford, the choices you no longer control. I've seen far too many smart, hardworking people give up decades of financial mobility because they chased a moment instead of building a foundation. So, my advice is simple. Don't let pressure convince you that you must buy in 2026. Let patience keep you free. Let discipline protect your future. And let preparation, not hope, decide when you're truly ready. If you found value in this perspective and want more clarity before making big financial decisions, make sure to subscribe. It might save you far more than you think.